Now, the title of this session is Clear Targets and Good Direction. And the issue is, what are the target options that policymakers have for industry to meet? And the way we've discussed it amongst the panel is trying to explore implementation strategy. Often it's easy to set a target, but how do you then go about meeting that target? How do you deliver? So we're going to go through and think through, and I'll ask each of the panelists to speak in this to these points. There is a policy and regulatory ecosystem in place to support the development of targets. How does that work in your jurisdiction? How does that ecosystem function? Are there certain steps that you can describe for us? Then to talk through, what are the mechanisms that you've got for dissemination, for training, for deployment, and in fact, enforcement? And then finally, probably to my view, the best question: what doesn't work? What's broken in this system? What do we need to fix? We're always good at saying, oh, look how good we are. We've done a great job, and this works, and that works, and this works. But often, what's the challenge? So I've asked them to do a sort of a mini SWOT analysis: the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. I then gave them a joker or a wild card, saying if there's anything missing, you can kind of talk about whatever you want to. So I'm looking forward to some surprises. So if I can start off and kick off with Andrew, we'll start at the far left and work in our directions. We will wait for Q&A till the end. At the end, I do have some questions that I plan to ask, but if anybody's got a question, it's going to take a priority over the question I was going to. So those are the game rules we've got. Over to you, Andrew.
So am I answering just the first question, or all four, or what?
You can speak to all the three that I've asked.
Okay. Let's see. I mean, California is a big place, right? It's big, it's diverse. I think one of the things we have going, that's just the scale that we have inherently as a market force is definitely one of the things we have going in our favor. Our population votes for things that move the needle toward sustainability, toward environment. It's a core value of our population for the most part. And that's reflected in the fact that we have a supermajority of one party in both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. And so, basically it's between the moderate Democrats and the progressive Democrats is kind of where the discussion lands. And that also gives us some weight to ride out, distortions that happen at the federal level. We also have strong institutions in this realm. If we want to sort of look at the highest level of what it takes to get stuff done, we have institutions that have gravitas, that have authority. The Energy Commission has quite deep authority on getting data, on convening stakeholders. And so we build records and we make decisions based on those records, and that process is respected and followed. And I could say the same thing about the Public Utilities Commission, the Air Resources Board, who are our sister agencies that have sort of similar briefs in terms of moving away from, moving towards a decarbonized economy and certainly energy systems. So those processes, I really take advantage of those processes to kind of force people's hands. Look, if you want a decision that's amenable to your industry, or you want to move in a certain direction, then you got to come and you got to play and you got to submit stuff to the docket, give us data, or you're kind of left out. And so that works. It really works. And we've been able to build relationships with I'll make a contrast between the federal government and the California government. I mean, we have a great relationship with the California Building Industries Association. Those are all the builders. Almost all the builders are members in California. And that's the big ones from, Meritage and KB and Lennar, all the way down to niche builders in certain counties or cities. And when we passed the latest update of the building code, which did some pretty muscular things, and moved us a big step toward, actually moved us to single-family zero net electricity. They were in the room and they supported the vote. They came in and sang Kumbaya with us and said, we can do this, we want to do this, and we think it works. And so you contrast that with the National Association of Home Builders, and they do everything they can to obstruct. And so, we think that there's movement there. There's movement there in a good direction through the International Energy Conservation Code, which I think we're going to see some really great improvements, but due to overcoming that barrier of status quo thinking. Let's see, so the next was barriers, right? So I'll just throw out a couple. Along with the kind of scale and the process we have come kind of institutional lock-in problems. And so our code is quite complicated. Our process can get a little onerous if you don't understand it. Undoing that complexity can be challenging. Another barrier I'd say is we've been through 20 years of restructuring in California, and that obviously produced some bad outcomes in the early 2000s. But a remnant of that is vertical disintegration, right? We're a restructured state. We don't have vertical integration, and whatever your sort of view of vertical integration in general in the utility sector, it does complicate linking sort of wholesale markets to retail markets, right? And so, whatever the conditions of the grid, in a given, in a given load pocket, in a given sublab, in a given, sort of utility service territory, if your wholesale markets aren't aware of what's going on at the customer level or at the circuit level, then it makes it really hard to send any sort of signal to the customer that gives them a reason to act in certain ways. So I think there's sort of a rate-making challenge at the retail and at the wholesale level to link up the incentives so that we can get the kind of grid responsiveness that we need out of our buildings. I talked a little bit about that this morning. So let's see. The other I would point out, and I'm sure it's a point of contention with most of the people in this room, is access to good data. Utilities have been operating in a regulated monopoly, relatively unimpeded and unchallenged for ever since the dawn of the electrical age, and there are issues with drilling into customer level data. There's privacy issues. I mean, not wanting to minimize any of those issues, but utilities kind of in a knee-jerk way have been really loath to allow other folks out there in the world access to data that could help decision makings and business model development. So we're, I think, probably in the forefront of breaking down that barrier, certainly in the policy community and at the agencies, and sort of moving our agency into the big data era. And I think, I want to sort of highlight that as a point of potential collaboration. I think New York City's done a lot of great stuff on data that, like with the benchmarking and collecting data about the building stock, which then allows you to target the underperforming buildings and really make better policy that's creating incentives that the private sector can really use to go out there and offer products that people want. And opens the door to doing mandates and doing disclosure and things like that really help move the needle in the marketplace. I think I've answered the three questions. What was the third one?
You've done a fine job on the three was actually what
great.
doesn't work in the barriers, and you've
Oh,
just
great. Okay,
addressed
got it.
that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the big areas. We can talk about all the stuff we're doing on decarbonization. We're putting a lot of resources into specific market development for products, heat pumps, and that is bleeding into some talk about mandates in different jurisdictions. We obviously have a big bankruptcy to deal with, so PG&E has I think distracted us for the moment, but actually things are remarkably moving in a normal way. The train's moving down the tracks. So I think there's a recognition of the urgency and how fast it's increasing, and that's going to keep being reflected in legislative discussions and keep producing bills that ask us to do bigger and greater things.
All right, thank you for those remarks. I'm sure that's provoked actually many questions that the audience would like to ask, but we will hold them until after all of the panelists have had an opportunity to intervene. So I'd like to turn now to Greg Steeves from the BC government in Canada, further north, but still on the West Coast, but looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you. And I guess from the policy perspective, what I'd like to really talk about is how we're using the BC Energy Step Code as a regulated pathway towards away from our current sort of minimum code requirements towards a staged migration towards net zero. And in doing so, I think really providing a way to bring some order to what's today maybe or yesterday was a bit of a confusing world of incentives and energy programs and other ad hoc programs that were sort of addressing energy efficiency or maybe even low carbon, but really not working towards a clear and prescribed outcome. And in that model, what we found is the role of codes and standards under that model is really almost a backstop, that any innovation and market transformation, for it's happening in response to maybe a government direction or incentives or programs, but it's not necessarily being driven by regulations or by regulations that are outcome focused. So one of the things that we wanted to do with the BC Energy Step Code was sort of turn that on its head and use the codes and standards as a way to describe the outcomes that we wanted to achieve over time, and then allow those other capacity building programs, whether it was incentives or financing or things like that, to focus in on supporting the code to achieve that. I think from, if we step back and how we got to the policy, it was really looking back a few years ago in bringing together builders who were telling us the difficulty they were having in dealing with the 202 local governments in our province, in that some were prescribing passive house standards, some were looking at percentage above code requirements, or better than code rather, some were looking at LEED requirements, and it was a real patchwork quilt as far as above code energy requirements. So in 2017, we launched the BC Energy Step Code as a voluntary measure with 5 prescribed steps building towards net zero energy or net zero energy ready. And at the same time, we restricted local governments' abilities to pass above code standards. So we have a building act in British Columbia. It works like a belt and suspenders with the Building Act and the Building Code. And we took away the ability for local governments to go above the minimum code unless they were following these voluntary prescribed standards, which I think was useful. I would say the other thing that came out of the consultations that we did in 2016 was the creation of the BC Energy Step Code Council. And a number of them are here, and they will, I'm sure, correct me if I get any of this wrong, but the council, I would say, is a coalition of the willing, and we wouldn't have been able to implement the code as a policy instrument without their support. It represents influential local governments, builders, suppliers, our utilities, and they all came together and took ownership over the code itself to guide its implementation. So as the regulator, we don't actually implement the code. The code is implemented by local governments, and they do so with the support of the council, by and large, does a lot of the education and promotion. So it's become a movement that is chipping away at getting step code adoption across the province. So right now, we have 24 local governments who have voluntarily adopted some level of the code, but it captures about 70% of our construction. So it's a significant rate. And over the next 3 code cycles, so 2022, 2027, 2032, we will progressively increase the energy efficiency requirements in the code. And what that will do is give the industry time to respond and to build their capacity and provide that ramp up towards net zero. Some communities where the capacity exists already will get there faster. And then subsequent iterations of the code will move up through the steps. And that will, I think, provide that smooth market transformation over time. I should say we're not doing this alone. It is being supported by a pan-Canadian framework on energy efficiency. So our objective was really more about getting in front of it. Barriers, I think, we have some unique barriers in British Columbia. It's a large province with very diverse geography. We have 6 different climatic zones that we are developing codes and standards for. And we are learning through code adoption that the challenges in achieving step code compliance in different climatic zones and different building typologies is not quite what we predicted. And we're, with the support of the Step Code Council, we're working through that. I think the other barrier is we're a province with a large supply of relatively inexpensive and relatively clean energy. So the motivation, the individual motivation for energy efficiency and for net zero carbon emissions is, it's a bit harder to build that transformation. And I touched on this before, but of course, working collaboratively with builders and the sector to increase the capacity to build this kind of housing. And then I think that the third thing I'll just touch on is just is leadership. So the other side of my portfolio, in addition to codes and standards, is affordable housing. And we've got a commitment right now to build 20,000 units of affordable housing that are underway right now, and all of them are being built to step 3 of the code or better. So not only are we encouraging the production of this voluntary code, working towards mandated adoption of the code, but we're also leading, I hope, by example in building energy efficient homes for some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
All right, thank you. Again, that's going to provoke, I've already got about a dozen myself, but I won't do that to you. I'd like to turn now to Emily Dean from NYSERDA, who will take us through actually some exciting recent news, I think, if that's part of your commentary.
Right. Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so I mean, I'm very proud to be here representing NYSERDA in New York State, and really happy to share that, two weeks ago, New York State passed what is the nation's most ambitious climate legislation. We passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, really leading the edge on climate, job creation, and equity. So what this law does is that it charts our path to a carbon neutral economy by 2050. It makes that a requirement. It codifies New York's clean energy targets into law. So that includes reaching 100% clean electricity by 2040 and 70% renewable energy by 2030. It also codifies targets for energy efficiency, storage, offshore wind, and solar. In terms of the process and how this will be implemented, it establishes the first ever Climate Advisory Council with extensive partnerships and participation across New York State agencies and appointed industry experts. And perhaps most uniquely, compared to our fellow states leading the way, it makes a landmark commitment to environmental justice and ensuring a just transition. So what it does is it sets a goal that 40% of the benefits that come from our clean energy investments will accrue to disadvantaged communities across New York State, with a requirement that at least 35% of benefits are delivered there. So as I mentioned, it also codifies into law the target that we established through the New Efficiency New York white paper that we published last year, which is 185 TBTU of end-use energy savings, roughly equivalent to 1.8 million homes saved in energy. So it makes that law as well. So in New York and in New York City, the policy and the regulatory signals are strong. We will decarbonize our grid. And we need to electrify buildings to use those clean electrons. But we also know that electrifying our buildings as they are today will yield a 4 to 6 times winter peak as what we're seeing right now. So energy efficiency must go hand in hand with the electrification that we're going to have to achieve over the next 3 decades. So in terms of the mechanisms we're using, NYSERDA is funded through ratepayer collections. And we have a 10-year funding plan, the Clean Energy Fund, which is a really unique mechanism because it allows us to think longer term and to manage a portfolio of initiatives across our sectors that we're serving, delivering shorter term, more certain investments and balancing those with potentially higher risk, but truly higher reward market transformative initiatives, like some I'll talk about later in the presentation. In addition to work that we're doing, providing technical assistance, being a catalyst, serving as a matchmaker, working on challenges and innovative challenges to sort of seed companies in pursuing new business models. A primary focus of mine at NYSERDA is ensuring that we have the trained clean energy workforce to meet our needs, because the clean energy workforce is really on the critical path to meeting these ambitious goals. And it's something we're working on sort of throughout the clean energy economy. We know from our most recent clean energy industry report that the clean energy industry in New York is growing. It's growing at 6%, twice the growth rate of the statewide economy. There are over 150,000 clean energy jobs in the state. But we know that businesses are really struggling to find talent. And so we have to help them. We have to build the capacity. We have to build the talent pipeline, if you will, for folks that are already in these positions and need to be upskilled, or for new entrants to this growing economy. So we've committed over $70 million over the next 10 years to support workforce development initiatives in that vein. So in terms of the challenges, I mean, I'd say the strengths, what we need ambitious targets. We need the targets that orient our resources, our people, our time, our effort. And we need leadership from the top, which thankfully we have. And we have peers in New York City and across the continent to help us inform how we get there. In terms of areas for improvement, always better coordination with utilities. That is that's something we doggedly work on, but we have a long way to go, ensuring that we're providing complementary offers and that really it is an easy customer journey. The customer knows where to go, and where utilities are, where there are gaps in the market that either NYSERDA goes in to fill, or we work with utilities to do that. I echo Andrew's comment about access to data. We have more work to do on that front. Something we teed up in our new efficiency paper is, building on the work that New York City has done on benchmarking. We'd like to see statewide benchmarking passed, and so we need to make sure that the data is available from utilities to make that easy for customers to do. And I think stakeholder engagement is really built into everything that we do. Getting market input and bringing folks along with us on this journey. We can't just rely on those that are already within the choir. But it gets complicated fast when there are many proceedings going on, and we have a process and it's transparent, but we're increasingly working on making it more so and bringing folks in to really inform the strategies that we're doing in a more accessible way. So I'll leave it with that.
All right, thank you very much for that thorough, and congratulations, by the way, on the legislation that got passed. I'm pleased that we've been joined by Costa Constantinides. I don't know if you'd like me to repeat the questions, or if you've got them covered. Yes. All right, over to you then.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon. My name is Costa Constantinides. I'm a council member who's also chair of the City Council's Environmental Protection Committee. And about 2 months ago now, we passed the Climate Mobilization Act, which included the regulation of large buildings over 25,000 square feet, in which there were only about 50,000, but those 50,000 buildings in the city of New York were accounted for about 30% of the city's emissions, which is really a staggering number when you stop to think about that. Somehow, only 50,000 buildings were responsible for a third of the city's emissions. So we started there because that's where the emissions were. And we went through a 2-year process. We went through a process to really try to get it right. We started with EUI, which I found was universally hated. We moved on from there to working with the administration. And I saw John Lee, who's here today, on a fossil fuel cap idea, which again we scrapped because that was not much loved either. And we ended up landing on carbon targets, because that was the disease that we're trying to deal with. And for that reason, we also, we made sure that buildings that were good actors, buildings, in the passive house network, people that were doing the right thing, they shouldn't have to be under, having to make retrofits that just weren't going to yield the benefits that we needed. There was a proposal out there that said, oh, why don't we just have every building just reduced by 20%? But for the case of the good actors, those that were leading the way, trying to get blood from a stone there, it didn't make sense when we had large buildings that were just not where they needed to be. So this target sets 2 compliance periods, one in 2024, one in 2030, and gives them each a carbon number with the worst emitters, the worst 20%, having to go first in 2024, and then in 2030 the other buildings have to come on board. We really, looking at the mechanisms we put in place for enforcement, we created a new office of building energy emissions performance that would assist building owners and give them the expertise to ensure that they could get there. We passed PACE financing to allow for building owners to make choices on how their loans would be structured in low or no interest ways. We wrote the bill that allowed for the purchase of renewable energy, as our friends at NYSERDA just talked about, as we're growing that green energy market in Zone J, and I can say that here with you guys. I know if my staff will yell at me if I use it in layman's terms outside, but I can say with you in Zone J, that's another way in helping to foster our green energy market here in New York City and New York State, so they're plugged into our grid. We also wrote good faith into the legislation about 4 times. And it was a very aggressive bill, but these targets are achievable. But if for some reason you go through the checklist and you go to OBEEP, as we affectionately call it, and they're not able to assist you, and you go through the PACE financing model and they're unable to assist you, if you go through the building, the accelerator, and they're not able to assist you, you try to buy energy credits and somehow the green energy isn't there, we can have OBEEP look at your number, see what's achievable, and tailor your number to your particular building if so needed. But you have to have good faith. So if you look at the biggest obstacles, the biggest challenges, it's the sort of buzz around this legislation that somehow we did something that was not achievable and it was only going to pad the city's coffers. I come here today to say, I don't want your money. I really don't. I don't want anyone's money. I want their carbon. And we wrote legislation to ensure, because if this does not work out, if this legislation somehow leads to fines, then we failed. We failed as legislators. We failed on a 2+ year journey to get us where we need to go, working with various stakeholders. We want their carbon. We want there to be the emissions reductions of 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050, which then becomes the largest emissions reduction policy in the history of any city. So we need to get there, and that's how we crafted this legislation. So the biggest obstacle is those misconceptions about what our goals were and the sort of throwing up of our hands before we even started to run the race. These goals are absolutely achievable, and we have mechanisms in place to ensure that buildings get there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very also motivating set of comments. So we want your carbon. Uncle Sam wants your carbon. I would like to open it up for questions. And when I see a flag come up, you put your flag up like this if you want to ask a question. If you're in a back row, raise your hand, and we will get you a microphone. And we're not shutting down the California Energy Commissioner. It's simply that we want that microphone for acoustics reasons. So any questions you ask? I would like to ask the first question of all of you. In your thinking about the regulatory approach, the standard-setting approach for buildings, are you thinking in terms of the full life cycle of the building? And I don't mean actually just from construction. This came up earlier. It's including the building materials. So if you go from building materials all the way through construction, all the way through functions operation until you get to decommission or demolition, are you thinking holistically in those terms? I don't know if you would like to respond to that.
I mean, I can start. I mean, the short answer is no, really. This is coming up a lot more, so it's certainly the next frontier. The life cycle of the building, the lifecycle assessment is maturing as a profession, and so I think that's where we do need to go. There are a few key aspects of that. One is the concrete industry is a huge source of carbon. So there is actually I'm hopeful about this move back towards wood frame construction, which is kind of starting to appear. But I will say in much of California, certainly in a lot of cities, while there's not an accounting of the carbon content of the materials that go into the building themselves, I mean, you can do the calculation, but there's really no teeth to it. There's no requirement. There's no real policy around this. In terms of building materials and actually just repurposing and recycling and reusing, that independently is just showing itself to be good business and is actually impacting positively the construction industry. So if you take up a bunch of concrete, it has a place to go. And you take all your stuff to the landfill, and they actually don't end up putting a whole lot in the landfill because they're finding other uses for all these things. And it turns out that that's doable within basically a market framework. So I think these threads are kind of getting closer, and it's becoming easier to conceive of having like a life cycle kind of requirement around buildings.
I will add on the life cycle, I actually do also mean the performance monitoring part of it. It's exactly that, but it's also often you hear the keys and you drive the car yourself. Well, what about the performance modeling to make sure that you're actually, if you want to add, is the building delivering what was promised?
I see that as one of the advantages of incorporating Passive House into the code and getting, the answer, I think the answer today is no. We're not really doing that. Once you get that certificate of occupancy, you've lost your leverage in the policy arena. But as we move towards moving buildings into the digital age and having communications and control technologies for, they're stimulated by rates, by demand responsiveness, by grid flexibility needs, that's going to totally dovetail with performance monitoring. And in fact, people are going to opt into that because they're going to be able to see trending and divergence from their baseline in an automated way that they don't even have to pay attention to until a red flag goes up and then somebody tells them. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for this data ecosystem to enable ongoing performance monitoring. And some of it's happening already, but it's just not at scale.
Okay, thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I think a lot of my comments would echo Andrew's. When you first mentioned life cycle, my first thought was when we developed the BC Energy Step Code, we did life cycle costing of all the different steps across all the different climatic zones. So it would provide transparency on what the cost of achieving energy efficiency would be. We require baseline performance monitoring and air tightness testing at point in time of construction. But to your point around the ongoing performance of the buildings, I think, like Andrew, we're not quite there yet. We do have the utilities at the table, though, and they are giving us data around ongoing consumption patterns, which I think is important. And we are hoping to, we've made a commitment for an energy or building code for existing buildings by 2024, and certainly energy efficiency and carbon will factor into that. So as we sort of look further down the road, we will by necessity have to create an opportunity for learning more about those buildings.
Thank you.
And I guess I would echo the pushback from the concrete industry on life cycle building issues, and we're a jurisdiction that's gung-ho on both wood frame and mass timber construction.
All right, thank you. Emily?
So I'll speak to the performance of buildings and sort of how we're handling that. Certainly at NYSERDA, using ratepayer dollars, we take the cost-effective use of those dollars very seriously in performance management and reporting around that. I'm excited that we have a program that's been out in the market for a couple of years now to called Real-Time Energy Manager, which really helps a building get both the hardware, the real-time energy management platform they need, and more importantly, the service contract to extract the knowledge and the insight from that platform and use it to change their building's operations, optimize, and identify improvements down the road. So I think that's we've been able to really build a burgeoning market around service providers, and building owners are really seeing the value, which allows them to make those changes and see those returns on energy efficiency that they've, particularly on just the low and no cost O&M changes they can make, and automatically see that return in real time. I think that's a really powerful tool when it comes to looking forward to complying with Local Law 97 and looking at other opportunities, just having that real-time feedback for how your building is consuming energy and having the real-time support on what you can do about it. Another initiative that NYSERDA is co-designing with our utility partners is around a true pay-for-performance model. So, we capitalizing on the advancements we've seen in measurement, verification, analytics platforms. We're designing an incentive program to pay based on what's saved at the meter, and so this allows both a quicker connection between the energy efficiency installation and the payout of the incentives. And it also allows vendors to come up with their own offering. We're not saying we're going to cap it at 20%. We're not saying you have to do a certain scope. We're saying deliver savings and we'll pay for them. And you determine what your customers want, what the opportunities are. And if you demonstrate those savings at the meter, we'll pay a rate for that. So we're excited about that. We're excited to be working with utilities on that. We're working with Con Edison to pilot that in Westchester and Staten Island on the small commercial side, and should have a lot to share on that as well. I'm also, in terms of monitoring performance of buildings, we see the cost declines on sensors and controls, and I think that really gives us an opportunity to better understand how buildings are performing, both in pilots that we're running, but also perhaps to better quantify some of the non-energy benefits that are really value drivers when we talk about investing in high-performing, low-carbon buildings. So whether it's monitoring noise, reduction in noise, or air quality improvements, things like that, I think that's going to be a real game changer in how we convey that value to the market.
All right, thank you very much. Kostas, would you like to add?
Yes, I mean, for the city regulatory framework and at Lifecycle, we thought a little bit about it in that we didn't just want to allow buildings to get that 20% reduction. Right, they're building a new building and they can build it, and then they can carve that 20% right off the top as part of the regulatory structure in 1253. That's why we didn't write the legislation with a percentage reduction. We wrote it knowing that by new buildings coming on board, that they would have to adhere to the carbon standards that we built into the legislation. That they'd have to come online having these new carbon numbers, because it wouldn't make sense not to build a building. You're building a brand new building and you have to comply in 3 years. It would just make sense to bake it in the cake right at the beginning. So looking at that and looking at ways we can, and we didn't prescribe any particular way of doing it. We didn't say that you have to do one way or put solar panels on your building. We left it more open to the building owner to make those decisions on their own building, so they could make get the efficiencies that they needed to get to that carbon number. So hopefully that would mean that they would think about these issues a little bit, and then look at the stretch energy code and other things that we've done to cut red tape and try to take advantage of opportunities in their buildings in the long term.
All right, thank you very much. I think, Andrew, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to, so the focus of this conference is mostly on residential, but I think the commercial sector in this realm of performance monitoring has really kind of already cracked this nut. There's a lot of service providers, certainly in Class A, commercial. I think we have to move down market, and get it ready for prime time. But there are great services that are providing demand management in very real time, in a very granular way, across whole portfolios of REITs. that are saving those customers a ton of money, and it's really just based on demand management and rate and just savings behind the meter. And so what we really need to do going forward, and policy really has a central responsibility here, is to crack that barrier at the meter to make sure that these buildings not only can just manage on their own behind the meter, but also respond to grid conditions in a way that leverages all this technology that's already there. And so that's the new frontier I think for getting that sector, the commercial sector, to really play. And I think we're all kind of thinking along these same lines. Great technology out there. And then finally, or second and final, I just want to say that I agree that it's highly likely that the health benefits of improved indoor air quality and the savings to our, well, say what you want about our healthcare system and its costs, but a couple of avoided emergency room visits by an asthmatic kid pays for the retrofit in a home, right? And so I think if we can work with the healthcare industry, the Kaiser Foundation and a whole bunch of really, really great actors in this space that want to collaborate on this and want to reduce costs and want to figure out how to actually focusing on the health of their communities and not just sort of their own bottom line. I think that's a really exciting. It's going to be a really exciting area to collaborate with them on, and they're already further down the line than the energy sector is on using big data for figuring things out. So,
all right, thank you for that. We made it halfway through my first question, and then I see a forest of flags of questions have gone up. So I'm going to call on Bronwyn first, because hers was the first to go up, and she's sitting all the way over here on the right. But I want you to set the example, please, of tell us who you are and who you're directing your question to.
Bronwyn Barry, North American Passive House Network. Thank you, Scott. My question is to two of the panelists, Costa Constantinides and Greg Steeves. The two policies that your jurisdictions have implemented are really innovative and quite groundbreaking. The STEP code worked directly with industry and integrated industry into the planning of the code. And I guess my question to Costa is to ask how have you brought industry along with you on your policy implementation? Because I wonder, the thing that we always hear from policymakers is a big pushback from industry and stymieing progress. And I'd love to hear the plan for getting industry aligned with the goals and helping implement them. I would be very curious to hear how that's being implemented. Thank you.
So, thank you for that question. The legislation itself was the product of a 2+ year engagement with stakeholders. I took more meetings on this bill than I could take on any. I didn't think of anything else in my life. I'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning just screaming retrofits and then go back to bed. So we met with stakeholders, and there was an advisory board that we were consistently work with that was impaneled by Urban Green that had everyone from big real estate to affordable housing to advocates and unions and everywhere else along the spectrum. And much of the legislation, and we included an advisory board that will give us some guidance as we get further along onto the second compliance period and beyond into 2040, 2050. They'll also look at things at portfolio approaches and whether or not there can be carbon trading. Of course, protecting environmental justice neighborhoods was a huge part of that as well. We carved out, I would even say carved out, but we used different compliance for affordable housing buildings until the issue around MCIs could be resolved. So there were lots of things that we came into agreement with the industry and tried to provide them as much stakeholder feedback as we possibly could. In the end, there were folks who were not happy where we landed, but that's sort of the nature of the world. If I could get everyone in this room to agree on anything, I shouldn't be in politics. I should be doing something else for a living. Miracle working. I think that we did everything we could, and we wrote the legislation with those things around good faith and being able to comply, and we coupled it with the PACE legislation in order to provide loan opportunities, and we built the new building, energy and OB. We built all of these things into the bill to help compliance, but in the end of the day, we we knew this had to get done because we just couldn't wait any longer. People were asking me, why did you rush this bill? I was like, if it's 2+ years. And actually, this was in 10 years in the works. So, it was 2 years of a bill form, 10 years of a policy sort of conversation. It was time to move the ball forward, and I think at the end of the day, New York City is going to be the better for it.
All right, did you want to, Paul?
Yeah, I'll just add to that we wouldn't have our step code today if we didn't have support from energy or from industry. Our step code, our BC Energy step code was adopted by our former government, which was a right-leaning government, and without the explicit support and involvement of those builder groups, there's very little chance they would have agreed to the voluntary adoption of the BC Energy Step Code, which put us in a really good position when our new, now left-leaning government came in to say, well, those last guys adopted this as voluntary. What can we do now to ramp this up a little bit? So, but without the industry involvement and the ongoing industry involvement through the Step Code Council, we wouldn't be where we are today.
All right, thank you very much. You had a question here on the left?
Thanks. My name is Jeremy Shannon. I'm the Director of Sustainable Design for the New York City School Construction Authority. So my question kind of goes back to your life cycle question, but also it's more centered on externalities. In New York City, thanks to Councilman Constantinides and Mayor de Blasio's efforts on kind of giving us a lot of great laws to work with, as we're trying to figure out how to make the mechanisms of city government and agencies work around those. One of the things I think is potentially a slowdown is if we don't actually figure out how to capture kind of the economic externalities. I know the One City, One NY 2050 plan that came out recently had actually a report talking about the jobs that will be generated, the growth to the city in terms of economic growth. But when we're actually trying to, through using energy models, trying to push forward envelope measures that all of us passive house enthusiasts are interested in here, the payback on those things, if you look at a basic model and see the payback doesn't look very good from a straight kind of cost payback to the city. And so trying to shift the mechanisms of the city to say these laws are not asking for a great utility payback at this point. We're looking for the carbon reduction and those things, and kind of looking holistically at what those individual measures are going to allow us to do. The question kind of gets back to how do we, now that we have these laws, we're lucky here that we have those, so other places have to catch up. But now that we have those laws, how do we then start to structure the mechanisms of city government and also private sector to be able to capture those sort of externalities?
Well, that's a thesis question.
I don't mind.
You want to try that?
I think your question is probably very locally focused, but one of the things that we've committed to doing moving forward as we look at existing buildings is full costing of all the proposed or new code measures that will come in, and looking both at the one-time costing and the life cycle costing of that. So we'll use that data to inform how the code, future iterations of the code that would be applied to existing buildings, how that implements. We think, though, as a thesis, that while the BC Energy Step Code for new buildings started in residential and will expand to other building types in the next code, and the return on investment in residential was actually quite neat and tidy. It was, the cost benefit was better than we thought it would be. We think we will see the reverse as we go into commercial buildings and existing buildings, that the low-hanging fruit will very likely be in some of our bigger commercial leases. So, and that's where we'll focus our costing and our code development.
Emily, you want to come in?
Yeah, just kind of to flip the question in terms of how we improve the economics of these projects. Certainly, as I spoke about non-energy benefits and sort of figuring out how we identify the value and quantify, or at least communicate that value for decision makers, is a big part of closing that gap. But we need to compress the cost as well of the solutions that are going to get us to these high-performing buildings. So my colleague Greg Hale will talk about this in the next session, but our Retrofit New York initiative is really about that. It's about challenging the industry to design solutions, panelized solutions that can deliver high-performing buildings, retrofits that keep our tenants in place and achieve near net zero energy performance with the comfort benefits associated with that. Really challenging the industry and doing that by aggregating demand for these solutions across large portfolios. And we're looking at affordable housing because it's a like building stock that we have a lot of across the state. Aggregating demand for these solutions. So if we can get the cost down, will you buy this? And then taking that soft commitment to manufacturers and saying, there's a pipeline here. Scale up your manufacturing to deliver these solutions at a lower price point. So we're early stage, but this is a very high potential opportunity that we're looking at and really drives the work we're doing in retrofits.
All right, I will want to change the way we do this for the last 5 minutes because we've only got 5 minutes left. First, I'm going to want each of the panelists to make a closing remark that's brief. Second, good questions make us all smart, so I want us to get through all of the questions. So I'd ask those of you who have flags up, there's 4 that I see. Could you ask a short question? We're going to go through all of the questions, and then I'll come back through the panel. All right, please.
Wonderful, thanks. My question is for Costa. My name is Maxwell Sykes. I'm the Climate and Energy Manager, City of Surrey, British Columbia. I'm also the chair of the local government Step Code Peer Network, and I represent BC municipalities on the Energy Step Code Council. I found in my discussions, and if you listen to speakers, including here, that there's a big difference in what sort of policy you can move forward, and the conversations that you're even having around policy design and trade-offs when you have the only real GHG target of 0. I'm wondering through your own discussions over the past 2 years, for those communities that haven't experienced something like Superstorm Sandy, what sort of arguments have you found? What sort of information have you found to be resonant in moving the political will on that level of climate action? Thank you.
Okay, let's hold the call. Let's get through all the questions. Okay. Go ahead. You got the mic.
One after the other, all right. Rob Bernhardt with Passive House Canada. When we started hosting sort of policy-focused sessions at Passive House conferences just a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, it was very difficult to have policymakers articulate or be comfortable in articulating clear and ambitious standards. And now it's very refreshing to have a panel here who's really very comfortable talking that language. And sort of reflecting back on the level of change over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm just curious if any of the panelists have any comments on the degree of change they see coming in the next couple of years.
Okay. And we have another question here, please. We're doing and then we're going to go down the path.
Good afternoon.
It works.
John Greaser from the Tri-County Regional Energy Network and the California Rural and Hard to Reach Working Group. My question is specifically for Emily. As somebody who is an administrator of rural programs focused on workforce education and training and codes and standards, I very much appreciate the conversations today generally about urban areas. But my question to you, in terms of New York, what exactly in terms of strategy or tactics is NYSERDA planning on doing to address workforce education and training and codes and standards support in rural areas of New York State? Thank you.
All right, and we have one final flag here on the left, and then we'll stop with the questions and start with some commentary. I didn't say answers.
Thank you. Bob Cavey, Praxis Consulting, and this question's for any or all of you. We've got some elections coming up, and we'll see what comes out of that. But as we sit here, there are social and economic forces in the U.S. and abroad that are more or less on a collision course with anybody who takes sustainability or sustainable building seriously. do you guys think that what you're doing is globally sustainable or globally scalable? And if so, what can the rest of us do that would help that along? The seas do not look calm right now.
All right, thank you very much for the questions. I will actually leave it to the panelists which or any or all that they wish to respond to. But actually, it is a kind of a closing commentary for you as well for this session. And I'll leave it up to you to expound, expand, and deliver as you wish.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So I'll just kind of rattle off a few issues that I know are coming up in the next couple of years and are definitely going to be fraught. One is the future of the natural gas grid. If we're talking about electrification and we're electrifying all of our heating loads, water and HVAC, and all we're left with is cooking. Whether it's new construction or existing, neighborhoods and pieces of the retail grid, that is not sustainable for a gas utility. That just doesn't work from a business model perspective. And so we've kicked off that conversation in California, and it's going to be a tough one. Okay, it's going to make nuclear decommissioning look like kind of small potatoes. So that is a question of our time, and I think the answer to that question is going to determine in large measure whether we actually meet the goals. I mean, there are pathways that don't have us meeting our goals, and we're all in our respective jurisdictions going to reach a point where we start telling our legislatures that we have to do mandates, and those mandates have to be more aggressive in order to decarbonize to the level that meets the goals that we've set. And will our respective legislatures have the political stomach will they have the will to keep down this path? And I think I'm not going to say yes or no. I believe that we will come up with options that will make it easier for them to say yes than it appears maybe right now. But that's a lot of work. We have a fire issue in California, and so that's absolutely driving our climate conversation as well. So fire response is going to open up, I think, possibilities to do more muscular regulations than maybe we would have been able to otherwise. It also, really impacts our rural areas and our sort of rural-urban interface areas. Another kind of conversation we've got to have is shifting metrics. So it's kind of wonky, but it's really necessary. In fact, there's federal law that prohibits energy codes or building codes from basing energy performance on anything but energy or energy costs. So you can't actually base a building code on carbon. And so that's maybe all of our lobbyists need to get going and try to change federal law. But that means that you really have to have, in the U.S. at least, a two-part metric. If you're going to do carbon, it has to be an add-on to the existing energy-related metrics. So we're finding ways around that, but it'd be much better to have it just simple and straightforward. Local government engagement, I think, is a huge need, and I talked about that this morning, so I won't repeat. And then finally, I think I might have said this last year at this conference, certainly at other, at sort of zero net energy fora across the country. Zero net energy is not zero net carbon. And so this idea that we have to manage load to utilize the green energy when it's available and not utilize the non-green energy when it's on the grid, demand responsiveness and load flexibility and all that stuff is fundamental to meeting our decarbonization goals. It's just not going to happen without that. And so, we can, maybe it's all storage and we don't really care about the demand side stuff, but I think the least cost pathway is definitely going to be to have load flexibility. Otherwise, we're going to rebuild our whole grid to some standard that we could have avoided. And so all these EVs and heating coming online needs to be interfaced with the grid in such a way that it can be part of the solution. So I think that's a big, another big area of research and certainly implementation going forward.
All right, Greg.
Good thing about going after Andrew, from my perspective, is I could just say ditto, literally to everything. And in my mind, I'm thinking, we're conserving energy so we can sell it to California, but I won't say that out loud. I think the biggest, my biggest takeaway on this is we've started down a path with a very clear sort of endpoint I'm not sure that our political masters understand that it's going to be a bumpy road. That we've done the easy part, which is just getting moving. How easy that was, I guess, is debatable, but I'm not sure they understand some of the really difficult decisions. Like California, we focus on energy consumption, not on carbon. So we're going to have to reconcile that at some point in time, and we're fuel agnostic in our code as far as where that energy source is coming from. So some tough decisions ahead, and some of those decisions are not that far away, certainly within a political mandate anyways. So.
All right, thank you very much. Emily.
Yeah, Andrew, we're in good company. It's the same. It's the same set of challenges facing us as we move forward. I'll take the rural programs question, which I really appreciate. So NYSERDA, our role in the energy ecosystem is really to ensure that, among other things, that low and moderate income residents are served with clean energy and energy efficiency. So we run programs across the state that provide no-cost energy audits and retrofits to low-income New Yorkers. And we're increasingly looking at how we build partnerships with our colleagues at HCR and also USDA rural assistance programs to better reach, ensure that folks are coming into those programs. A few initiatives that I'm excited about in this area. We are working with HCR to pilot zero energy modular homes. So looking at how we can deliver that net zero energy performance within the mobile home and manufactured home sector. So we'll be kicking that off soon. And we're also working on a healthy homes pilot. So partnering with our colleagues at New York State Department of Health to deliver health and energy interventions together in homes, and then quantify the avoided emergency room visits and pharmacy visits, and quantify the savings to the healthcare system, to our Medicaid system, to allow us to leverage that to deliver these interventions in tandem going forward. So I'm really excited about the promise of that program as well. And then, in terms of closing, getting to the kind of the community, the harder to reach communities, and really looking at community scale, that's what this legislation really forces us to do. I think we have some pretty good understanding of how we're going to serve building by building, but we really have to take it up a level and think about buildings in a community connected to the grid and serving transportation needs as well. And so we welcome partners as we really chart down that road.
Thank you. So, Maxwell, just to answer your question about communities that were not impacted by Sandy, how do we get them to understand the seriousness? That we were lucky in that this debate, everyone sort of understood the seriousness of Sandy. Even though a neighborhood maybe wasn't impacted, we were able to pass legislation 45-2 by explaining the importance of what was going on, and they got it. And if you weren't impacted by Sandy, you could see where your neighborhood could potentially be impacted by a future Sandy. If you lived anywhere near water, in New York City is a city surrounded by water. So many of my colleagues got it. It just kind of, the vote itself came along political lines. The only two votes against it were two great guys who were Republicans from Staten Island, who I just couldn't sell them on energy efficiency and that sort of stuff. But it was more politics than policy. The other question around how do we scale, I think that we look at, we've already had other jurisdictions reach out to us and ask us about how do we move forward. And I think these conversations are how we scale it globally, is being able to come together and compare what Andrew's doing in Los Angeles and we're doing in New York State and in British Columbia and all of these great jurisdictions. I think that the dialogue that is put forth today is how we scale these up and we ensure that there is that future. That legislators are working together and we're not just doing things in silos, but that we're doing things that have connectivity and that able to be duplicated in different jurisdictions. We wrote this legislation, we didn't call it the New York standard because we want other jurisdictions to emulate it. And at the same time, there are plenty of things that other jurisdictions are doing that we want to be able to look at and point to and say that if you can do it there, why can't we do it in New York? So I think there's a lot, that give and take is how we scale up in the long term.
All right, well, thank you very much. Try to summarize that session, because I've had thesis questions, thesis answers, and it's not very obvious. But you hear the question of how do you scale this up? How do you get the world to recognize that the technology is there today, and we could do this yesterday, but we need to get on with it, that we're not going to get on with it unless there's a good collaboration between industry, developers, regulators. The whole community has to be engaged. And the fact that this is a connected world where it's not a question about energy efficiency. It actually is a question about quality of life. It deals with health. It deals with indoor air quality. It deals with comfort. It deals with the range of issues.